Hi, David here with Independence Live. I've got Jonathon Shafi with me. Jonathan, how are you doing?
Not bad, thanks very much for inviting me on.
It's a pleasure. You're representing the Radical Independence campaign.
Yep.
So you were quite deeply involved in the referendum campaign. We didn't win. But how do you feel about the result overall?
Well, I mean, clearly disappointed, but I mean, I think there's a lot to be drawn from it. We've talked a lot about the scale of engagement that took place, the political awareness that has been raised, and which evidently remains raised after the result, so that's a huge positive. I think as well that it was clear that working class Scotland voted yes, voted for change, voted to escape and to evade the austerity measures coming from Westminster and to start afresh. And I think that what we have to also consider is the degree to which the corporate elites, the establishment Westminster, the media, the whole club gang together to prevent Scotland from voting yes. And even despite all of that solid pressure for particularly the last 2 or 3 weeks, 45% in terms of the vote is something I think we can be very proud of.
Yeah, I mean, radical independence was always more about the process. Okay, there was an end game, but it wasn't all absolute. It must be yes. It was about what is the process doing for Scotland. Do you agree that?
I think when we set up the campaign, we initially set up the campaign as a way of contextualising the debate from the left, putting forward radical policy ideas about how Scotland might run. But fairly quickly, the campaign turned into something much wider and much bigger than that, in terms of we started to think through quite seriously that we could play a role in terms of changing the outcome of the vote in particular areas, particularly in areas where there had been very low turnout, where we targeted through mass canvasses, and I think we're very successful in terms of mobilising the vote on the run-up and on the day itself in particular areas. So we became more than a talking shop, more than a think tank of the left, and much more an organisation where people could be really active in terms of mobilising concrete votes.
Definitely, and I think it'd be fair to say that Radical Independence were one of the most influential groups within the entire referendum campaign.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we wanted to influence the debate, but it became clearer that actually what we also needed to do was to help to shape the narrative that was being put to the people of Scotland. I mean, we argued from the start that to say to the people of Scotland that nothing will change if you vote yes, it wasn't going to lead anywhere. And I think that we at least made a serious contribution towards that argument.
Okay, so where now for radical independence? What is the long game? It's a good thought through.
It's a good question. I mean, it's a question that we'll be deliberating at our conference, which is in the Clyde Auditorium, the 22nd of November. Now, I have to say that when we advertised the conference the day after the no vote, we weren't too sure about the response that we would get, but we're overwhelmed. So 3,000 people will meet there, which I think is the biggest indoor meeting of the radical left in Scotland for many, many decades. So it's at that conference where we'll discuss collectively where we go forward.
Okay. We're hoping to have Independence Live actually cover the Radical Independence conference, so check out independencelive.net for details, okay? Now, there was some criticism. Some people said that the RIC was too focused on engaging the working class left voters and not appealing enough to a wider community. Perhaps the middle classes maybe saw that as something which went against their values. I mean, is that a fair criticism, or is it all quite compatible?
Well, I think that, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I view things in a slightly different way. In terms of, I think that actually that the Yes campaign, at least for the first year, if not the first year and a half, was actually too safe in terms of its messaging, and I think was attempting to ease people's perceived fears. But I don't think that's what was going to win the referendum. I think what you had to do, and what we attempted to do with a whole number of other organisations, was to raise people's ambitions about what was possible, and was to say that very directly that really class was fundamental to what was going on here. I mean, and when it turned out, and I think we were proved fairly close to the money on this. If you look through where constituencies voted yes, they are the constituencies which have suffered the most from Westminster over the last 3 or 4 decades. So I think that what we need to focus on throughout the referendum remains the case now. We need to focus on how we're improving and helping to work with the people who are bearing the brunt of the austerity measures in particular.
Okay. Do you think that the Yes Scotland failed in that sort of middle class section? Essentially, that was the area that they seem to want to go to.
I think the Yes campaign, in terms of its overarching narrative, got some things right and some things wrong, like any campaign will. But I think one of the things that it felt confused about, and I think in particular a section of the SNP leadership got entangled in this idea that actually if you joined NATO it would make Scotland more acceptable. If you were to cut corporation tax, maybe you would win over some more business people. But for us it was always clear that you were never really going to win the military establishment to the project of Scottish independence. Neither were you really going to win, and this was made evident in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, the big corporate elites to the question of Scottish independence. They're too hardwired in to UK PLC for you to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to win the corporations, you're not going to win over the people who do well out of a system that's designed to serve the rich and the elite. But how do we get the public to actually understand what is working within their interests and what is working against their interests? Essentially, all the banks and corporations are working against people. Their agenda is to take as much money out of the economy for themselves and to employ as few people as possible to do that.
Well, one of the sort of fascinating but sickening things about the way the system works is that very often people will advocate views and activities which are actually counter to their own interests. And a lot of this comes from the way the media operates, the messaging that people get from basically the moment that they can speak or understand language, that they are taught to think in a particular way through the media. And one of the most, I think, impressive things about the campaign since the result on September the 18th is a commitment to seriously thinking about how we can move beyond corporate media. And I think that kind of opening up of not just radical ideas, but a diversity of opinion about how you might approach problems like poverty or inequality or war, I think that can be very significant in the years going forward because it can cut through these kind of mixed up ideas that are put forward by the media.
Indeed. We spoke to Leslie Riddick last week and we discussed the Nordic approach or the wider Scandinavian approach to a balanced society. It ties in quite well with a very famous book called The Spirit Level, which demonstrates that it's actually in everyone's interest to have minor differences between rich and poor because the social ills, the drug addiction and various other things are less severe. How can we actually properly sell this message to the middle classes that it's within their interests to allow the working classes to rise together so that they're all working for each other?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say to that is that we have to face head on the idea that the UK, when you look at any of the social indicators, when you look at the fact that the richest people in the UK, the richest 1% have increased their wealth in the last year by 15%. That's 15% growth in the last year, at the same time as 1 million people relied on food aid in the last year. That we live in a deeply, deeply backwards and regressive society in the UK. So regressive that even fairly liberal reforms that have taken place in various European countries make them look radical. I mean, that's the whole thing about the Nordic model. There's nothing particularly inherently radical about it. It just feels and looks so much better than what we've got here because we've been taken down such a bad political, social and economic route by the Westminster elites.
I mean, you wouldn't call any of the Scandinavian countries left-wing, would you?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, what we're actually asking from someone said to me during a debate, doesn't the word radical maybe turn people off? I've always opposed that, actually. I think that there is a space inside Scottish society for there to be a radical left putting forward ideas which may not be hugely popular with everyone, but what you quickly found out is that the sort of ideas that we were putting forward, actually, were they really that radical?
Yeah.
I mean, we're putting forward the idea that you shouldn't have to rely on a food bank, you know, or that public services might actually be quite a good thing, given the nature of the system means that there will always be people who fall off of the economic treadmill that, as you point out, much of the middle class are on just now and are being squeezed.
Yes, indeed. Now, you did a great deal of work, highly commendable work, to bring people into the voting franchise. I mean, people who would not have voted in this referendum were registered by the Radical Independence Campaign.
Yeah.
So where did that idea come from? I mean, there must have been a real serious motivation within to go out there and actually physically do that work?
Yeah, I think where the idea comes from is that if you're serious about winning the referendum, then you have to mobilise and be part of a mass mobilisation of that section of people who actually have it in their very best interests to vote yes, in their very best interests to resist through voting peacefully, democratically, at the ballot box to stop what Westminster has been doing for the last number of decades. And therefore, if you think about who that is, it's often the people who, in my view, not apathetic, but deeply alienated from the formal political process, and in my view, deliberately alienated from that process. It's no mistake, by the way, that when they shut down a library, they shut down a community centre, that this is something which is seen as being more than just an attack on those particular amenities. It's an attack on there being the possibility of developing a political and a democratic culture in a community. Because where do you learn about the world if it's not a library? And where do you meet and discuss political issues if it's not a community centre?
How do people respond to you? I mean, when you arrived at their door, politicians, would avoid these areas. Not so much the people, but politicians wouldn't work in particular areas because, low voter turnout. It's not a good use of time. But you arrive there and you say, well, we're here to educate you, or we're to talk to you about this referendum campaign. Was there a resistance? Was there a, we're not interested? Was there a, it's all a lot of...
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things about that. I mean, first is that when you get 100 people into a community who are not trained politicians, it's a very good thing, because we're ordinary folk. And we're going around speaking to other ordinary folk about the things that matter to our lives. But also that huge numbers of the activists that were involved in these canvass sessions and in this mobilisation were from the communities themselves. Okay. So it wasn't as if we were sort of just touring round. I mean, if you look at the national days of mass canvassing, where there's over 1,000 people take part in those events, a lot of them from all kinds of communities where they've been fighting for year after year to try and get people engaged, and they've had real success in doing so because of the independence referendum.
Okay, it has been asked, is there room for an RIC, Radical Independence campaign, style mobilisation of unregistered voters in the rest of the UK for the May general election? Or are the new rules that have come into place, are they going to be an obstacle to that?
Well, some of the rules that they've put in, I mean, to me, are completely regressive in terms of political engagement, in terms of encouraging people to get out and vote. But I'd say that the biggest problem that we face in terms of getting people out to vote is they've no one to vote for, particularly in England. I mean, the alternative that's been offered there, if you want to, express your discontent with the establishment, is to vote for a city boy called Nigel Farage, who's everything the establishment is, and worse in many ways when you look at his ideas about immigration. And unfortunately, the whole of the political system in England is moving towards the right because of the UKIP factor. So I think in England we have to think seriously about how something's being offered from the left. And I think in Scotland we've seen a huge political awakening, which means that I think people will be very engaged for some time to come. But we need to keep the diversity of ideas flowing throughout the next couple of years. I mean, I'm a great believer in unity when it comes to independence, but I'm not in favour, and I've never been in favour of, and Radical Independence never been in favour of, unity that dilutes your own principles. Everyone that's involved must be able to argue, to debate, and to promote their own point of view, even if it's not the most popular point of view with the major party of the day.
Okay, so what do you feel that people are telling you they want from a new politics?
I think that the most important thing about a new politics is empowerment. The problem that we've had, I mean, neoliberalism as a process is one which takes power away from the workplace because it's a detriment to trade union rights. It takes power away from communities in the way that we've already talked about today. And therefore, if we want to resist, to challenge, to oppose neoliberalism and neoliberal politics, then I think that the basis of that has to be to empower people to do it for themselves. And new politics needs a completely new approach as to how we organise and how we go about things. Now, I'm not saying that Radical Independence got everything right. Of course it didn't. As I said at the start, every campaign is going to make mistakes. But one of the things I do think that we did well was that we did get across this idea that you didn't need to ask anyone for permission to do something. You could just go and do it, and you'd have, as long as it was within the remit of the organisation, the full support and the backing of the campaign. I think that's important.
Okay. Now, coming out of this referendum process, there's a very new political arena, and the game has changed. Now, Labour went into coalition with the Tories as part of the No campaign. And with the Tories, they also agreed with freezing child benefit, foreign war. They legislated to impose the bedroom tax. They supported nuclear weapons. They have a commitment to austerity. They support the House of Lords and also this first past the post system. I mean, is it fair to call them the Red Tories?
Well, I mean, I think that we have to. I mean, yes, I think it is. I think it is fair, but I have to say that I don't think you can just make your whole analysis Red Tories. I think we have to make a few other points. I mean, the process that's been going on inside the Labour Party that's turned it towards the right, towards the kind of austerity consensus and so on, has been a process that's been ongoing for a very long time. You go back to Clause 4, you go back to, of course, the Blair years and, what he did to the Labour Party. This is a trajectory the Labour Party have been on. And what they've done throughout that is they've not only eroded their own electoral base, but they've eroded who they're recruiting to the organisation. So no longer are they recruiting the sort of calibre of people that they were recruiting in decades gone by, because the people that really want to fight back, that really want to stand up for the interests of the working class aren't joining Labour anymore. And this creates huge issues for them as a party. And I do think that the way they're going, I do have views on where they're going to go. That will be important, I think, in terms of the way the rest of Scottish politics goes as well. Okay.
Now, what do you think is the issue here with Scottish Labour? Scottish Labour are not actually a Scottish Labour Party. They are the branch of Labour which represent in the Scottish Parliament. Why is it Labour can't get it together to have a Scottish Labour Party, independent of but allied to the UK Labour Party? In the same way that the Greens, you have the Green Party of England and Wales, you have the Green Party of Scotland.
Well, I think a number of reasons. I think that partly the Labour leadership in London and HQ just doesn't really understand at all what's going on in Scotland. I think also as well is that they don't want to accept that there is much of a difference between what's going on in Scotland and what's going on in England. I think that if they were to accept that, it leads them into a whole series of other arguments about devolution or indeed about independence. What I think Labour Party is going to do is, generally I think what's going to happen is the SNP will think to themselves that their left flank is covered. And I think that Labour Party, as a result of that, will start to think about how they're going to win the vote of Middle Scotland rather than their traditional working class heartlands. And in doing so, I think that the combination of those two factors means that the drive in Scottish politics now is very much towards the centre. I think that both opens up challenges and opportunities for those in the radical left who want a fundamental challenge towards neoliberalism. It's worth pointing out that there's a whole discussion about the nature of the SNP to be had here as well, and there are a lot of people who view the SNP as a left party, certainly in comparison to a lot of the other more technocratic parties in Europe. They are to the left, certainly in terms of Westminster, they are to the left, but they're not as radical as, for example, Bennism in the Labour Party. They're not as radical as some of the ideas that were coming through in decades gone by from traditional Labour. So what we've got here is we've got quite a complex situation, but one I think that requires a long discussion and serious analysis about what's going on. So Red Tories, yes, fair enough, but I think we have to have a deeper analysis of what's going on here as well, if we're actually going to replace the Labour Party, and I think that's what we need to do.
Okay, just thinking about the Labour Party still, I mean, is there an appetite there, do you think, even beneath the surface, for a greater degree of autonomy in Scotland, a Devo Max? Or is this, I mean, is it endemic right through the Labour Party that they just don't want Scotland to have?
I just don't know how Labour, I was about to say I don't know how Labour are getting away with it, but the reality is they're not getting away with it. But they've claimed themselves to be the party of devolution. But look at the Smith Commission positioning. You look through the range of powers that's been deliberated and debated and discussed, and what does Labour want for Scotland? Well, they want partially one other power, which is about corporation tax. And why do they want that? So they can have an argument with the SNP, because the SNP, in my view, wrongly lowered corporation tax or made that pledge.
Yes.
So in terms of the Labour Party being serious about devolution, I don't see it. In terms of the elements inside the Labour Party that particularly come from places like the STUC, people like Dave Moxham and other people like that. No, I think they are far more genuine about this type of idea. I think they do want home rule, these people, and that's why I think they've started a new organisation, or at least an attempt at grouping people together inside the Labour Party to campaign for autonomy in Scotland within the Labour Party. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Labour Party's dead, it's done, it's over, and we need to think very carefully about how we replace it in the interest of working people.
Okay, I'll just following that, I've got a great quote here from Derek Bateman who says, if you thought this fight was over, you're wrong. Unionists can't stop themselves from stamping all over the Scottish aspirations and killing stone dead anything that smacks of real autonomy. Is he being a bit harsh there? Or
no, I mean, I think that's largely fair enough. I mean, if you look at, we had this debate, so-called debate in Westminster, about the vow and all that sort of thing. Yeah. That, the party leaders don't turn up. I mean, the whole thing is a complete farce.
It was something like
utter farce. And they're all going to pay for it. They're going to pay for it at the ballot box. But I think we need to be quite honest with you, right? I think that UK-wide there needs to be a mass rebellion against what's going on in Westminster. A mass rebellion against the Tories. The way people are living now in terms of reliance on food banks, in terms of cuts to disability allowance and all these kind of things, workfare and all the rest of it. I mean, to be quite honest, it's now beyond a joke. And we've really got to think about how we're going to resist this in a very, very serious way. Okay,
well that maybe brings us to the concept of a Yes Alliance. Yeah. Now this is one that's been a little bit complicated because, there are various views. I mean, should we all vote SNP at the next general election because we know that we can get SNP to beat Labour, particularly taking votes, if SSP follow with voting for SNP as well as the Green Party, and then we take the swing vote away from Labour. We know we can displace Labour, we can put Scottish MPs that speak for Scotland down in Westminster, but of course Stuart Hosey and Angela Constance have also said that, we should actually be talking about an alliance here, bringing the Scottish Socialist Party in, bringing the Green Party in, and standing candidates, essentially conceding. Is that a sensible way to go, to start to think about conceding SNP places in favour of SSP, or are we going to confuse the electorate? Is it too short a time period?
I don't think it's so much. You see, I think the discussion's slightly too focused on the three parties that you mentioned, because actually the independence movement's much, much broader than just those particular organisations. But what's clear to me is that the SNP will be looking to deliver as many SNP MPs as they possibly can. I'm interested in thinking of particular seats and where we might have a real chance of bringing on someone new who could actually start to... I think we have to do something more than just defeat Labour at the ballot box when it comes to 2015. I think that we need to send a message at that election that there is a new generation of people who would have been potentially Labour members in years and decades gone by who are now actively campaigning against them. But we also want to campaign for things as well. Yeah. So I want to support candidates, and Radical Independence has agreed that we would support the objective of backing candidates who aren't just pro-independence but are resolutely anti-austerity, who are anti-privatisation, who are anti-war and so on and so forth. There are a whole number of things that we need to think through when we talk about this. But I think that people in Scotland will react on 2015. And I think the Labour Party's in for a real shock, because I think they've always thought to themselves when it comes to Westminster elections that the Labour Party's pretty much untouchable, because you're faced with a choice, aren't you, of are you going to let the Tories in or are you going to vote Labour? I think now that they've had this whole referendum campaign and this whole political awakening, that there's going to be some real shocks in that night. At the same time, we're going to have a longer battle to go here. I mean, Jim Murphy, in my view, probably will get re-elected. So we need, what I'm arguing here, right, is that we need to have long-term thinking. We need to have some staging posts for how we're developing over the next number of years. There's not going to be another referendum in 2 or 3 years' time, in my view. It's a number of years away. I do think there will be another referendum, but it's a number of years away, and therefore we need to think very strategically and very methodically and in a very long-term manner about how we're approaching things.
Do you think there'll be a referendum announced at the 2016 Parliament, so within that term, anything up to 2020?
Well, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. No? I mean, I don't think the SNP, for example, are going to put it in their manifesto that they want another independence referendum in that cycle. That's my view, and I think that's probably backed up by the fact that their own backyard in many places voted no, and I think they have to think that through in terms of their own electoral ambitions when it comes to the Scottish Parliament. So that's my view on that. I don't think that's going to happen. Now, the problem we've got here, right, is that there may be many people watching who think that's a disgrace that I'm saying that there's not going to be a referendum in the next couple of years. But it's important that we have that discussion, because it's important that we start to calibrate what we're doing and what we're thinking, and start to think seriously about when is there actually going to be another referendum. As I say, I do think there will be, because I think the UK state's in a complete crisis over this, and not just over this. I think there are a whole number of fronts in which the British state is under real pressure. So I think what we have to do is to steadily build, is to continue to build, and at the same time as that, we've got to take on board people's everyday concerns while there's no referendum in place. That's about austerity and cuts and privatisation.
Okay, the mainstream media, what went wrong?
Well, the mainstream media particularly the BBC, there's an important thing to recognise here about the BBC. Because the BBC, whenever there's a real moment of crisis for the British establishment, the BBC will close ranks. Yes. They did it in the miners' strike, they did it with the Iraq War, they did it with a whole number of other examples that I could go through, and they did it with the independence referendum. It was a deliberate thing that was going on here. I mean, the media coverage from the BBC was a fix. Yeah. You know, it was, it was something which actually they've, I think, almost accepted, because they got to the point where they didn't even really bother trying to rebut the idea that they were biased over the question of the referendum. Yeah. I always remember in particular one video they produced which was absolutely farcical, and I don't know if you'll recall it. It was about Trident and what happens with Trident. Some of the people watching might remember it, but the way it depicted what would happen with Trident in the event of a no or a yes vote was absolutely farcical, and the BBC have lost a whole lot of legitimacy and credibility with a huge section of the population.
Yeah. There's a thing to think about on that. That if the mainstream media infrastructure is in collapse and its credibility is shot, and the social media and the new media, ourselves and various other, we've got Usenet Scotland, who's teamed up with Derek Bateman. Yeah. We've got Wings Over Scotland. We've got Bella Caledonia, with a whole range of new contributors. It's becoming very mainstream. Do you think that with that shift in balance of new media, that we can actually really, not to contradict you, but actually be looking at a country which is ready for independence much sooner, just in terms of understanding the issues and being engaged?
I mean, I think that's possible, but again, I think we have to look at both sides of the coin here. You see, here we have to address something. It may well be that in the next 2 years, and I actually would agree with this, that the people of Scotland are ready for independence. But we are dealing with the British state here. And you're dealing with a situation where they have to sign off another referendum process. I think that's going to be a battle. I personally don't buy into the idea of a universal declaration of independence at this point in time. I just don't think that's viable. In fact, I'll go further than that. And again, people, when they're watching this, they need to recognise that I'm saying this from a place. I mean, I'm saying this from a place of looking forward and positively about where we go. But we've got to bear in mind about how we make ourselves constantly appealing and attractive to wider layers of people, right? And if you've just had a referendum and immediately after are calling for a universal declaration of independence, I don't think it sends the right message. I think the message that we need to be sending now is that the people who will fight most against austerity, the people who will campaign most for media democracy, who will campaign most for political engagement to remain inside communities and workplaces and so on and so forth, are the people who fought the yes side of the referendum. We have to be absolutely at the front of all of these kinds of initiatives to show that we weren't just in this for a changing in flags, but we were in this for a great deal more. And I think if we do that, we will get our independence in the end. I would just like to quickly add, if I may, my dad came over to this country from Pakistan at the age of 4, married my mum, who's from Scotland, and the whole question of race and racism and all of the propaganda you see it is I think a very important one. And it's been a great privilege of mine to be part of a movement which has been so vast, involved so many people thousands upon thousands of people at public meetings, rallies, demos, everything. And despite the pervasive nature of the propaganda about immigration and race and all that type of thing, never once did I hear anything, not a scintilla of racism. And that's important, very important, because it tells you a lot about the character of our movement.
I think more people need to understand that. I mean, people outside of Scotland really should do well to understand that. There was a majority, yes, within the Asian community as well.
Right,
I mean, I think the Asian community were one of the first of the the immigrant groups to properly embrace yes as a.
Aye.
Yeah. Well, what do you think was the factor there? I mean, some people have said it was a lot to do with small and medium-sized enterprises understanding the new economic model. I mean, was it more personal? Was it more to do with identity?
I mean, I think that, it's like any group in society. You can, boil it down to just one or two reasons. But I think for the Asian community, I include myself in this, is, when you look at the foreign policy displayed by the UK, and I don't think it's something specific to that particular community, because actually, everyone is repelled by the foreign policy of the UK. But I think when you add things like that in, when you've got a government that puts around immigration vans, right, and you know that your family is from an immigrant background,
yes,
it tells you something that maybe actually we better get out of this and look towards a far more outward-looking and multicultural society, which I think, we should never underplay the fact that, racism exists in Scotland. But in terms of the pro-independence movement, it was a fantastic show of what multiculturalism is all about. It's about social progress, and it's about working together. And that movement, it moved me because of that. Yeah. This movement moved people for all kinds of reasons. But I think that was one of the most important to me.
Okay, well, we'll try to draw things to a close here. Could you tell us a little bit about your involvement with the New Scottish Left project? And is that the correct title?
Yeah, I mean, what this is, it's an attempt to have a discussion, to have the possibility of there being a platform that means we can be coordinated as possible when it comes to elections. When I say we, I mean the left, I mean the radical left. Okay. There's a lot of people who currently feel fairly politically homeless about where they're going. There are existing organisations and political parties such as the SSP and the Greens, and this is about saying, can we find some way of being absolutely coherent when it comes to making sure that progressive voices are getting into not just the Parliament but councils and so on. And I think the other thing is to say that we want to learn from what's going on in Europe. There are a whole number of organisations there that have managed to really develop in an atmosphere whereby there are huge movements taking place which have managed to find expression through a political party. In my view, that means that political parties need to change the way they operate and change the way they relate to people. Yeah. So the Left Project is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to pull people together, to have discussions, to engage with trade unions, with campaigns, with community groups, and to raise the discussion about how we might be the most coherent possible when it comes to not just 2016 but beyond as well, as far as the socialist left is concerned.
Okay. Now, news just in. I don't know if anybody's heard about the Scottish surf team. Okay, the GB surf team, the Scots, have declared independence. They've declared UDI.
Yes.
They've declared themselves independent, and they're away to Peru. They're in Peru right now at the World Surfing Championships as the Scottish independent surf team. Hey. Brilliant, isn't it? Okay, so we're all getting into the surfing now. We're going to open up our Sunday Herald and go straight to the surf section. And so, how do you feel about that? That's people. Win. Well, but I mean, this is a sort of personal declaration of independence. I don't know if it's entirely political. We're still to speak to them about it. We should be speaking to the Scottish surf team live from Peru at some point soon. But I mean, this is I don't know how political it is, but essentially they've said, okay, but there's no need for us to be part of GB. We can be a Scottish surf team, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it doesn't need to.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. No.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope they win. That's the key thing. Because
I mean, if they come last and the GB come at top, it'll be a different story.
Well, that's the thing. But if they win, it would send maybe quite an important message. You never know.
Indeed, it will. So hopefully we'll be bringing you the Scottish surf team live from Peru quite soon. So stay tuned for that. Jonathon Shafi, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks very much for the invite.
Okay, absolutely. I'm just going to say once again, we are still in the process of a crowdfund. So If you have saved some money by not paying a TV licence quite legally, then do spare us a thought. We don't get paid for doing any of this. If you look in our archive, we have something like 250 hours worth of material, and we're continuing to build. So please look at the proposal, let other people know that they can donate. If you want to donate monthly, £1, £2 a month, that would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, so thanks very much for joining us. Good night. Peace.